Hello and welcome to the History Chronicles. If you like our work, then please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the channel in return for exclusive perks, please visit our Patreon page. Now, on with the video. Today's History Chronicle begins in the 1530s, when English rule was rejuvenated in Ireland, beginning the long process known as the Tudor Conquest of Ireland. The English crown had long had a substantial presence in Ireland. Beginning in 1169, successive waves of Anglo-Norman and Cambro-Norman knights from Wales and England had begun arriving in the east of the country to carve out estates for themselves from the dozens of independent Irish lordships which covered the island. Over the next 2 centuries, the English presence expanded to the extent that much of the country was ruled by Anglo-Norman earldoms, such as those of the House of Ormond, Kildare and Desmond, while East Ulster in the north of the country was ruled by the Earldom of Ulster. However, the Anglo-Norman conquest of Ireland in the 12th and 13th centuries had never been fully completed. Large stretches of the country and regions such as West Ulster, with the great lordships of the O'Neills of Tyrone and the O'Donnells of Tyrconnell still held sway, were never conquered. As a result, 2 cultures were to be found in Ireland during the late medieval period. An English-speaking Anglicised culture, which nominally owed its allegiance to the kings of England, who in Ireland held the title of Lords of Ireland, and an Irish-speaking Gaelic culture, which had its own unique system of laws and politics. What was more, from the late 14th century, as England became bogged down in the 100 Years' War in France, and then the War of the Roses in England, a resurgence of Gaelic power occurred in Ireland, leading to the loss of land by the English nobility there. In tandem, the English of Ireland began Gaelicising and adopting Irish customs. Such was the situation in the 1530s when the Tudor conquest of Ireland got underway. The spark which led to the English monarchy taking a more active role in its Irish lordship at this time was a rebellion by the most powerful English noble family in Ireland, the House of Kildare in 1534. The Earls of Kildare had been the de facto heads of the English lordship in Ireland for half a century. When they rebelled in 1534, Henry VIII was forced to send a significant crown army to Ireland to put down the insurrection. It was quickly crushed in 1535, but Henry and his government now found themselves having to develop a new approach to the governance of Ireland. What would they do? In the end, the new approach favoured evolved quite haphazardly. Many English officials in Dublin, the seat of the Crown presence in Ireland, favoured the idea of a renewed programme of military conquest and colonisation, but Henry VIII was largely unwilling to pay for this. As a result, a cheaper policy was introduced of trying to force the Irish lords to accept Henry as their sovereign lord and subsequently adopt English political and cultural norms. Henry was accordingly proclaimed as King of Ireland in 1541. And a programme known as Surrender and Regrant was implemented, whereby the Irish lords would surrender their lordships and then have them re-granted to them by Henry, with English titles such as Earl and Baron. The idea was to make English nobles out of these independent Irish lords. Surrender and Regrant, however, would soon run into problems. Several major lords such as Con O'Neill of Tyrone and Murrogh O'Brien of Thomond agreed to take up the title of Earl of Tyrone and Earl of Thomond respectively, as did nearly a dozen other Irish lords. But the scheme did not operate as it was intended. In particular, the Irish lords were willing to accept the benefits which came with becoming Henry VIII's subjects, both financial and political, but really made no efforts to anglicise their lands or give up the mores of Irish political culture. As a result, in the dying months of Henry VIII's reign in 1546, a group of English officials in Dublin began to adopt a more aggressive policy platform in Ireland. In the summer of 1546, they instigated a regional war in the Irish Midlands, which at the time was dominated by the lordships of the O'Moores and the O'Conors. During the reign of Edward VI, between 1547 and 1553, this quickly escalated into a full-blown war in the Midlands. Eventually, a decision was taken to begin colonising the region with English settlers. The Midlands plantation, which ensued in the 1550s, has an important place in the history of English and British colonisation as the first major colonial initiative undertaken by England during the early modern period. As such, it was a precursor of the push to colonise North America a half a century later. The inception of the Midlands plantation can also be seen as marking a distinct shift in English policy in Ireland. From this time onwards, more aggressive policies were favoured. and there were further efforts to initiate colonisation schemes in the northeast of the country in the 1560s and 1570s, as well as further to the south along the southern coast of Munster, where colonial adventurers such as Humphrey Gilbert and Sir Walter Raleigh wished to create a series of ports which could be used as springboards for English colonial activity in North America. Similarly, new taxation schemes and administrative reforms, such as the appointment of English provincial governors in the provinces of Munster and Connaught, were implemented, the goal being to break down the power of the independent Irish lords. Yet these measures had an unexpected backlash. It is hardly surprising to find that the Irish of Ireland were opposed to these aggressive English encroachments into their affairs, but what caught the government by surprise was the increasing opposition of the Old English, those English who were descended from the medieval settlers in Ireland, to the Tudor conquest. In particular, the Old English of the towns of Dublin, Cork, Galway and Waterford. The nobles, such as the Butlers of Ormond and the Fitzgeralds of Desmond, were opposed to increasing levels of taxation imposed on them to pay for the conquest. They were also increasingly alienated by the Protestantism of the new English arrivals in Ireland, which clashed with the continuing adherence of the Old English to Roman Catholicism. The result of all this was further rebellions, ones which increasingly saw the Irish lords acting in conjunction with the Old English. These flared up regularly in isolated regions such as the Midlands and Connaught, but in 1579 a much more dangerous insurrection began. This was led by Gerald Fitzgerald, the 14th Earl of Desmond, and soon involved the vast majority of the Old English, as well as the Irish lords of the southern province of Munster. Moreover, the Desmond Rebellion garnered support from both Spain and the papacy in Rome, who sent hundreds of troops to Munster to aid Desmond. It would take 4 years for the English crown to bring the Desmond Rebellion to an end. When it was finally crushed in 1583 and Desmond was hunted down and killed, a decision was taken by the government of Queen Elizabeth I in England to more fully secure the south of Ireland by initiating a massive plantation of the lands of Desmond and his allies across the province. The Munster Plantation, which was planned and initiated between 1583 and 1587, was the most significant colonial project ever undertaken by the English state up to that point. It involved the plantation of 350,000 acres of land, which was divided up into estates and granted to nearly 60 English crown servants, such as Sir Walter Raleigh, who alone received a 42,000-acre estate. The Munster Plantation was designed to end Irish political culture in the south of Ireland by having the plantation grantees bring in settlers from England. They would also build new colonial towns and villages, foster the Protestant faith, and facilitate the expansion of the English courts and administration into the region. However, these measures would take many years to come to fruition, although eventually they would. And during the course of the 17th century, Munster was gradually transformed into a bastion of English rule in Ireland. But back in the 1580s, the Crown still faced many obstacles in its drive to pacify Ireland completely. None was more pressing than the independence of Gaelic Ulster. Here the lordship of the O'Neills, led by Hugh O'Neill, 2nd Earl of Tyrone, and that of the O'Donnells of Tyrconnell, led by Red Hugh O'Donnell, adamantly refused to allow English administrators to operate on their lands. During the course of the early 1590s, this led to conflict. A proxy war in 1593 over the Crown's intervention in the Maguire lordship on the southern boundary of O'Neill's lordship was followed the year after by outright war between the Lords of Ulster and the Tudor state. The 9 Years' War, as it became known, had begun. The 9 Years' War was the most extensive threat to the English crown in Ireland during the entire Tudor period. In its early stages, it was somewhat localised to the north of Ireland, in the province of Ulster. However, the English crown had underestimated the military capabilities of O'Neill and his allies, particularly their adoption of modern firearms, which the Irish had been stockpiling for years in the north. It was with these modern military methods that O'Neill, O'Donnell, and their Confederates imposed a stunning military defeat against a large English army in southern Ulster in the autumn of 1598. Victory at the Battle of the Yellow Ford now saw England's position in Ireland drastically weakened. In the weeks that followed, the rebellion spread throughout the entire island, with insurrections in the provinces of Leinster, Munster and Connaught, and by 1599 the vast majority of the country was in the hands of the Irish Confederates. The only exceptions being a few walled towns such as Dublin, Cork, Waterford and Galway, and the immediate hinterlands of Dublin itself. Moreover, the Irish were in contact with Spain, and in 1601 a Spanish armada of several thousand troops arrived in southern Munster to aid O'Neill and O'Donnell. Ultimately, though, the Irish could not match the administrative and military power of England, which was a centralised Renaissance state that could call upon greater resources if needed. Between 1599 and 1601, an army of unprecedented size was built up by Elizabeth I's government, totalling nearly 20,000 men at its peak. With these forces, an aggressive military strategy was adopted of establishing garrisons throughout Ireland and inducing famine throughout the country in order to starve the Irish into submission. This, combined with English victory over the Irish and their Spanish allies at the Battle of Kinsale in South Munster at Christmas 1601, was enough to turn the course of the war. And eventually, in the spring of 1603, O'Neill surrendered to the Crown Viceroy, Charles Blount, Lord Mountjoy. Victory in the 9 Years' War might be said to have brought the Tudor conquest of Ireland to an end, although there were ambiguities. For instance, incredibly, O'Neill was pardoned following the war and allowed to remain as Earl of Tyrone. However, the increasing encroachments of the English administration into Ulster in the years ahead left him increasingly disillusioned. As a result, in 1607 he left Ireland for Rome. In the aftermath of his departure, a decision was taken by the government of the new monarch, James I, to confiscate approximately 3.5 million acres of land across Ulster and grant it to English and Scottish subjects. This was one of the single most ambitious acts of social engineering ever attempted in Europe, and it transformed the landscape of Ulster, with very grave consequences down to the present day. Thus, the Ulster Plantation should rightly be viewed as the culmination of the Tudor conquest of Ireland, although it postdated the end of the Tudor dynasty by a few years. With it, Ireland had been transformed from a mixed state of English crown enclaves and independent Irish lordships in the 1530s to one in which the crown's writ largely ran across the entire country. All of this had been largely achieved through conquest and conciliation. Hence, as well as pacifying Ireland, the Tudor conquest of the country during the 16th century might also be said to have led to the creation of England's first colony, and to have been the first step on the road to empire. You have been watching the History Chronicles. We'd love to know what you think of the Tudor conquest of Ireland. Please let us know below, and if you enjoyed the video, please give us a like and subscribe. It really helps us out. And if you would like to support our work going forward, please visit our Patreon page. And we look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of the History Chronicles.